a.m. sighted land ahead and almost immediately the smoke of a ship which proved to be HIGNS Emden coming out.
Warrnambool has a great, really rich history when it comes to military. But to have a vessel named after a city is a huge.
Welcome to our special Anzac Day feature. First in, last out, the Silent Anzacs. When a lot of us reflect on this day every year, we remember the images of young men scrambling off boats onto the shores of Anzac Cove on Sunday, April 25th, 1915. I was the same until I found out there was a whole other side to this story, and it started almost 12 months before the Gallipoli landings, and in some instances was taking place at the same time as those brave men were landing on Gallipoli. This side of the Anzac story belongs to the actions of the Royal Australian Navy in the early stages of World War I, which quite literally resulted in the Anzac story as we know it now. Warrnambool also has its own significant chapter, not during the First World War, but in the months after the Second World War, and again, many years after that. I hope, like me, that after watching this feature, you too will have a new appreciation of the significance of Anzac Day and the contribution of the Australian Navy from its inception to the present day.
The Royal Australian Navy was commissioned in 1911, and in 1913 the Navy's first fleet entered Sydney Harbour. In 1914 the Royal Australian Navy's first joint operation took place in New Guinea.
The Royal Australian Navy basically came about after Federation. Before Federation, you had individual colonies, and each colony had their own land forces and army, and a couple of the colonies had their own ships. The British Empire was huge, and they wanted to make sure that their sea lanes and areas of maritime operation were kept secure. The Navy, in its current form as being the Royal Australian Navy, was very, very young. When the outbreak of World War I happened in 1914, they were called upon to defend the British Empire's interests as well as Australia's, and they did end up fighting against the Germans, and there was action before Gallipoli.
It was during this operation that Australia lost its first of many thousands of lives during World War I. He was a sailor, his name, Seaman William Williams, one of 25 Royal Australian Navy soldiers tasked to neutralise and seize German territories in the Pacific. These men were a volunteer force, known as the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force. They were hastily trained and deployed and were responsible for Australia's first major World War I victory.
Unfortunately, there was another person killed. He was a doctor. They used to wear a red cross on their arm, and he was tending to the wounds of Able Seaman Williams. He gave his Red Cross armband to a stretcher bearer to take out Able Seaman Williams, and unfortunately he was shot. It was a fierce, what they call a skirmish. People died and people were wounded, but it was sort of overshadowed through later events during World War I.
Sadly, 6 Australians died in the conflict. That was the September before the Gallipoli landings. It was Australia's first joint operation.
The success of the Warrnambool and Herbert Show and most of the other German territories in New Guinea now being occupied by Australian troops was marred by the unexplained disappearance of one of Australia's first submarines, the AE-1, along with all 35 hands of her crew. The AE-1 and AE-2 were Australia's first commissioned submarines. They arrived in Sydney from Portsmouth after 60 days voyage at sea, which was a record for submarines at that time. The two E-class submarines played a major part in the capture of the German forces in New Guinea, as they were tasked to guard St George's Strait and defend Australia's Navy ships from a dangerous fleet of German destroyers headed up by Vice Admiral von Spee. On September 14, 1914, the AE-1 disappeared without a trace, becoming one of Australia's most enduring naval mysteries.
The AE-1 was part of the naval squadron that rallied around and sailed towards New Guinea for that first purpose of capturing the German stations there. It went down with all hands. It was catastrophic. No one knew what happened to it. To lose a whole ship and a crew is like losing a battalion. It's like devastating. You've lost that asset of the vessel, but more importantly, the whole crew. Submarines are quite unique where they have that ability to be sneaky and hidden. Most of the time you'd probably know about a submarine when you either were hit from a torpedo or you'd see the wake of a torpedo.
Yeah, that was huge. And again, in your basic training, you talk about and you learn about that history and you really do reflect on it. What would it mean to lose a whole submarine? It's something that I think is very hard to fathom in the modern age where, things are very different. Those first few weeks of submarine training, they go right back to the very first submarines and then move through those AE-1 and AE-2 times, especially because of the Australian links to them. So very different to how we do things, but without a doubt, important history.
So the fact that we've lost the submarine meant that we weren't able to disrupt the Germans as much as what we could have, but it was a big wake-up call in the fact that we did lose a complete vessel and its crew. It would have been a wake-up call to not only the Admiralty, but also to the people planning the troop transports on their way to Egypt.
On December 20th, 2017, the final resting place of AE1 and her crew was discovered off the Duke of York Islands in Papua New Guinea after over a century of efforts to solve the riddle of her disappearance.
Kind of information that submarines can provide during those early phases is invaluable for the later follow-on forces, whether they be beach landings or whatever the naval operations are. Submarines are there to send that information back and in many cases and ideally never be seen and never even be known that they were there. The movie that we watched as young submariners was Das Boot, which is a German movie based on the German U-boat, so obviously very different side of the coin here. But that movie brought to life how hard life can be on a submarine, how perilous it is, the cat and mouse aspect. And although it's a German story, as submariners, you really do share what you do across many nations. So yeah, we didn't know what we were getting in for. And I think that's a lot of what these sailors were like as well. They got in there and did what had to be done.
After 3 days, the search for the AE1 was called off, and the Royal Australian Navy's attention turned to the conflict in the Indian Ocean. Spee's fleet was still at large in the Pacific, and 2 German raider ships, the SMS Königsberg and the SMS Emden, were posing a huge risk to the transport of Australian troops, namely the first Anzac convoy.
They're constantly on watch the whole time, and again, they didn't have the radar technology that we have. They didn't have the ability to communicate over long distances like we have today. So a lot of their communication will be done by semaphore, which is flags, or with the Aldous lamp, and so they have to be within view unless there were other means to send a signal. So when they got a signal, they had to sort of act on it straight away, because they could lose where the enemy is. They can't look at it in real time and go, the enemy's moving this way or that way. The problems that they would have had, they've got to protect these troop ships, which they'd be more important than protecting another naval ship. The troop transports, the Navy would sacrifice themselves to save that troop transport. So the role they played, even though it's not a glorious one, but it's a pretty important one. It could have been, as I said before, absolute catastrophe if we lost a ship, a troop transport. And if the Emden was allowed to keep raiding in that area, it possibly could have happened.
In just 6 weeks, the Emden had destroyed oil tanks at Madras and had sunk a Russian light cruiser and a French torpedo boat.
pretty famous, all right, the Sydney Emden. Yeah, without a doubt. Again, another pivotal battle that really set Australia up, to show what we were capable of. And very strong links back to the UK, obviously, from that's where a lot of our forces originated from. But it's times like that that really showed the Australian independence and started forming a name for ourselves, and then New Zealand to a degree as well, started forming our names for ourselves in our own navies as those conflicts started coming a lot closer to home and moving down towards Australia.
The Emden provided a huge risk to our troops heading towards the Middle East and needed to be stopped, or history as we know it could have been very different.
Sir, I have the honour to report that whilst on escort duty with the convoy under the charge of Captain Silver, HMAS Melbourne, at 6:30 a.m. on Monday, the 9th of November, a wireless message from COCUS was heard reporting that a foreign ship was off the entrance. I was ordered to raise steam for full speed at 7 a.m. and proceeded thither. I worked up to 20 knots and at 9:15 a.m. sighted land ahead and almost immediately the smoke of a ship, which proved to be HIGMS Emden, coming out towards me at a great rate.
The Sydney and the Emden were in a what they call a gun battle, so there was no torpedoes involved as from a submarine. They knew that each other was in the area. The Emden was raiding the Cocos Islands, and the people there sent out a message, and the Australians intercepted that message, and they detached the Sydney to go and attack the Emden. It was a victory to Australia, and that's one that not many people know. If the Emden was allowed to still raid in the Indian Ocean, that would have had catastrophic effect on the troop transports that were leaving Australia. These ships that were converted to troop transports, and they'd have the term Her Majesty's Australian troop ship, full of soldiers en route to Egypt for training.
I kept my distance as much as possible to obtain the advantage of my guns. Her fire was very accurate and rapid to begin with, but seemed to slacken very quickly, all casualties occurring in this ship almost immediately. First, the foremost funnel of her went. Secondly, the foremast, and she was badly on fire aft. Then the second funnel went, and lastly the third funnel, and I saw her making for the beach on North Keeling Island. She was grounded at 11:20 a.m. I gave her 2 more broadsides and left her to pursue a merchant ship which had come up during the action. I have the honour to be, Sir, your obedient servant, John C.T. Glossop, Captain.
HMAS Sydney's victory over the Emden meant that our Anzacs, travelling in convoy in troop transporters, could continue without threat from Spee's squadron. The battle went down in history as Australia's first and decisive naval engagement, and if the Sydney hadn't detached to investigate distress signals indicating an enemy warship was close, it's believed the loss of life within the first Anzac convoy could have been catastrophic. All this, to this point in time, was prior to the Gallipoli landings. Earlier, the story of the AE-1 was spoken of, but its sister submarine, the AE-2, and its crew were about to become stuff of submariner legend. As the Anzacs stormed the beach at Anzac Cove, the AE-2 sits 80 metres below the surface of what was then known as the unpenetrable Dardanelles Strait, waiting for the right opportunity to surface and cut Turkish reinforcements and supplies off at the pass on their way to the shores of Gallipoli.
I'm like everyone else. I think of Anzac Day. You see the vision of men clad in khaki storming, the beaches of Gallipoli from the rowboats. But what people don't really understand is the Gallipoli campaign was initially a naval campaign, and it was a failed naval campaign on the part of the British and the French. They tried to penetrate the Straits of the Dardanelles unsuccessfully, and history for thousands of years have always made it almost an impossible task to win in that area. The Turks had gun emplacements that were mobile. They also had forts that could fire into the strait, and the British and the French suffered some heavy losses. The second submarine, HMAS AE2, that was tasked with penetrating the straits of the Dardanelles prior to the actual landing at Gallipoli, and they were given the orders to run amok.
I mean, the images of people storming the beach, but on the other side of that, there's submarines, and the objective of a submarine is in many cases for you never to know that they were even there. So the Dardanelles was a very tricky body of water, very shallow in places. There were lots of enemy ships operating around the area, so very little room to manoeuvre for those submarines. And the other big deal that separates sort of these submarines from where we are now is they've got to come to the surface quite regularly to get air in, to refresh the air for the people inside, and also to run the engine. So they can't just go deep and hide for days at a time like we can now. They've got to come up regularly. So it's a real game of cat and mouse, trying to use the light, trying to use the dark. Tough times.
This virtually unheard of mission started at 02:30 hours on April 25th, 1915, hours before the Gallipoli landings. It's due to this achievement and actions that came before it that the AE2 is known as the Silent Anzac.
Blow main ballast. Blow main ballast. Hand holder. 100 feet. Reverse engine. Full astern.
With the AE2 now identified inside the Dardanelles, attention is diverted away from the massive invasion forces about to land on Gallipoli. Every ship inside the Dardanelles is now on high alert. All of its defences are focused on finding this single Australian submarine.
Engine room's been hit, sir. The hole's above the waterline. Can we guide? Impossible, sir. No control.
Meanwhile, the clock ticks over and the Anzac Day landings take place.
The AE2 survived for a few days. They engaged the enemy a few times. They sunk a ship. They were attacked on several occasions. As I said before, they actually have to surface so they can breathe and generate electricity for their batteries. When they do that, they tell the enemy where they are. So they were attacked on the last occasion they were being shot at. They've dived, and unfortunately they ran aground and they scuttled the AE2s. All the sailors were captured 3 or 4 days after the initial entrance into the Dardanelles, but they did run amok, they did do their job, and the fact that they actually penetrated the straits was a feat in itself. Whilst the beach landings were taking place, the AE2 was running amok. So it was prior to anyone stepping foot ashore, so hence the term the Navy were the very first into Gallipoli.
On August the 7th, 1915, some 4 months later, a specialist unit known as the 1st Australian Naval Bridging Train, manned by members of the Royal Naval Reserve, landed at Suvla Bay, north of Anzac Cove, and named the camp Kangaroo Beach. The unit was made up of 300 reservists, 50 of which served in the New Guinea campaign. They were responsible for building and maintaining the wharves and piers used to upload supplies.
The last out part refers to the Royal Australian Navy bridging train. Bridging trains years ago were set up with like the army, and they would cross rivers, and so they're like engineers, where the Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, set up a bridging train, and they would construct wharves and do all the other bits and bobs to free up the army to fight as infantry. The Gallipoli campaign, the biggest problem they really had was water. They couldn't get water to ashore, beside all the other supplies. So they needed to construct wharves and to get ships in. You know, ships just can't sail up to the beach. You know, they have to have deep water, so they needed to construct that. So a lot of these wharves were built and maintained.
Often their work took place under enemy fire and air raids. And it was these same wharves and piers that would be used to evacuate soldiers from Gallipoli. In December 1915, the order to leave Gallipoli came through, and troops were evacuated under the cover of darkness. All the while, the Navy's bridging team continued their work. While the majority of the bridging team were evacuated between December 16th and 17th, 1915, a group of 50 remained to maintain the wharf. The last of the British rearguard would leave from. On December the 20th, 1915, the majority of the Australian Imperial Force troops had left Gallipoli by 0410 hours. The remaining bridging team troops left at 0430, meaning they had also become the last to leave Gallipoli, 8 months after AE2 entered the Dardanelles.
The evacuation of Gallipoli was probably the only successful part about it. The Brains Trust thought they would lose a lot more people. It was successful. They really didn't suffer any casualties as such. From memory, the last Australian soldier to step off the Gallipoli Peninsula and onto a boat was at 4:10 in the morning, and 20 minutes after that, the last Australian was an Australian sailor, so Royal Australian Navy person left at 4:30. So hence AE2 was the first in and the Royal Australian bridging train was the last out, so we like to say first in, last out. I think probably most of the blokes would have been thinking that they left their mates behind, and that would have been more of a sad occasion. They may not have thought about, you know, what the Navy was doing at the time. Everyone really wouldn't have cared what the others were doing. Everyone was just doing their part, and I think if you were evacuated and you left one of your mates behind, that would be the worst part about it, knowing that this lad would never come back home to Australia and be buried properly. That would have been a pretty sad occasion. So I think there was total silence when they had to leave. You know, they didn't telegraph to the Turks that were leaving. They deceived the Turks into thinking that they were still on the peninsula, and that's why the campaign the withdrawal, was so successful as opposed to a failed campaign.
In the Royal Australian Navy, to have a ship named after a city is a huge honour. The city of Warrnambool has had 2 ships bear its name. The HMAS Warrnambool 1, or J202, was one of 60 Australian minesweeper vessels known as corvettes, and in her 7 years of service, her accomplishments and place in Australian war history is something that I, as a Warrnambool local, and the Warrnambool community, and in fact our nation, should be both aware of and proud to commemorate. She was commissioned in 1941, was present in Darwin as it was bombed by the Japanese, carried out 5 evacuations or rescue trips, survived 18 air raids, and ferried over 4,000 troops in New Guinea. That was all in her first year of service.
The Navy just don't come up with names for ships willy-nilly. There's a lot of thought goes into it, and so Warrnambool, the city of Warrnambool, has been honoured to have 2 vessels. The corvette during World War II has an esteemed history when it comes to action. On the 27th of April 1943, the US freighter called the Lydia M. Child was coming from San Francisco. It was coming to Australia. It was bringing what they call lend-lease or war supplies, and it was sunk by a Japanese submarine off the coast of Newcastle, Australia. The Warrnambool, HMAS Warrnambool 1, the corvette, and another corvette, the Dardanelles, rescued all the seamen. From my understanding, that none of them were killed. One of the American sailors, a man by the name of Stevenson, he painted the painting that we have up here on display of the Warrnambool, and it sort of depicts the rescue in progress. And it is an amazing painting, and it's just an amazing story in itself that here's this little corvette that's bearing the namesake of Warrnambool, has saved an American lad, you know, who's probably his very first time to Australia. He gets sunk by a Japanese submarine, and as a result of that, his life was saved, and he was an artist, and a pretty good artist as well. So that's a very treasured painting that we have here.
After the Second World War ended, J202 paid a courtesy visit to our city and was anchored in Lady Bay, where locals would take boats and even surfboards out to the ship, where they were then welcomed on board by the crew.
Yes, we sat on it. We were down there one day and happened to be in, and we got on it. Yeah. Oh, well, that's a big thrill to think that you could sit on the Warrnambool. We went down to see it and got on it. You were proud because of Warrnambool.
Warrnambool has a great, really rich history when it comes to military. But to have a vessel named after a city is a huge honour. It's not something that every city has that honour, but the fact that we've had 2 just doubles it.
After this visit, Warrnambool and her crew embarked on her final mission as part of the 20th Minesweeping Flotilla, tasked to clean up sea mines from the war. It was during this operation on September 13, 1947, near the Great Barrier Reef, where she struck a mine, and 4 of her crew were killed, 32 were injured, and the Warrnambool herself lost.
During the course of having to clear these mines, it was struck by a mine. 2 sailors were killed instantly, and another 2 died of their wounds. So we've lost 4 men, and those 4 men were from Victoria. There was a score of other chaps that were wounded, badly wounded, and we're not talking about a company of hundreds and hundreds of sailors. There's not many people on board a corvette, so a lot of them were wounded. They did try and save the Warrnambool, but unfortunately it sunk. They train hard. They train right to the very limits of danger. They have to train that way to prepare themselves for war. A lot of the stuff outside of training that they do is extremely dangerous. And as a result of the things they do, people lose their lives doing it. And if these mines were left just to float around in the sea, that an innocent ship could have hit it, and it could have been a huge loss of life. But the 4 sailors, that died is a very tragic thing. but they really died because of something that happened during World War II, but it happened 2 years later.
Those 4 sailors were all Victorians. Their names: Signalman Norman Lott, Stoker Ronald Garrett, Ordinary Seaman John Hyland, and Able Seaman Donald Sigg.
Once the jolly swagsmen camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited.
History shows that the efforts of the Royal Australian Navy, their exploits, achievements and losses during war and in times of peace have often been overlooked. From the first victories in World War I in New Guinea, the first Australian life lost in World War I, Able Seaman William Williams, the first devastating loss of Australia's first vessel and all hands, the AE1, to the first huge victory at sea with sinking of the German raider Emden. That's without mentioning the heroic exploits of the AE2 and their crew, the first submarine to successfully penetrate the Dardanelles, referred to as the finest feat in submarine history. The Navy was the first into Gallipoli and was the last out, with a specialist unit known as the first Australian Naval Bridging Train, ensuring the wharves of Gallipoli were safe for the final troops to evacuate safely, before they too left those shores and sadly left to other theatres of war yet to come. As President of the Warrnambool RSL, we are extremely proud to have had 2 Royal Australian Navy vessels named after our city, and proudly display the white ensign from the Warrnambool too and other memorabilia telling both our ships' story. It's these stories, this proud history, that still inspires our Defence Force services and personnel today, both locally in Warrnambool and all around our nation.
Oh, it woke me up. I used to work in a factory, and then when I joined up, I was somebody. You know, I could put on my uniform and get on a tram, and that was pleasing. Yeah. Yes, you were always proud that what you were doing, even though it wasn't sort of brilliant. You just do things and you get your meals and you get to look after them all. And but it was a thrill. Yeah.
I'm extremely proud of serving in the Navy and what the Navy has done from its inception to currently what it's still doing today. When I joined the Navy, it was the height of the Cold War, and I joined back in the 1980s as a general entry sailor. My rating was what they call electrical technical weapons, so I'd fix up all the weapon systems, the torpedoes, the guns, and after nearly 7 years I then discharged from the Navy in 1995. I've always been one of those people that have loved, you know, like everything that Australia does when it comes to the military history, and probably the big thing about Australia is that they'll just jump in and help their mates out, who they are, doesn't matter. Like they try and pick the right side to be on morally, and sailors have that bond with their shipmates just like the Army did. You know, you hear about the Anzac legend, it's all about mateship. Well, sailors have that same mateship, close bonds.
I joined the Navy way back in 1998, which seems quite a long time ago now. You can't join submarines straight off the street, so I was originally on surface ships. I was on HMAS Anzac, where I sort of learned the basics of what it's like to be in the Navy. And pretty soon, a few of us were only in our early 20s, thought it would be a good idea to go over to submarines, not really knowing what it was all about. Submarines are based in Perth as well, so it wasn't just going to submarines, it was going to, you know, what was a long way away from anywhere. So after a couple of years in the Navy, I did join submarines. My background's electrical engineering, and on a submarine there's 2 engineers, one electrical, one mechanical. So my goal was to work up to be the engineer on a submarine, which I eventually got to, which was great. Once I'd done that job, I was still keen to keep serving in an operational role, so I applied to go over to Special Forces in the Army. And that particular element of the Army, they draw from all three services, and got through selection, and then was with the Army for a number of years after that.